Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to day 1096 of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. Today marks the third anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. To commemorate this momentous and tragic day, the Shevchenko Scientific Society has brought together three very talented scholars from Ukraine to you in this webinar to offer analysis and reflections on how the war has changed Ukraine's religious communities. My name is Catherine Wanner. I'm the Learned Secretary of the Shevchenko Scientific Society and a professor of history, anthropology, and religious studies at the Pennsylvania State University. Today, each of our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes on what they see as the key dynamics driving change in Ukraine at this critical juncture, and what the likely consequences of these dynamics might be for religious communities and religious life more broadly in Ukraine. I'll introduce each of our speakers one by one, and they'll offer their comments, and then we'll turn to your questions. I invite you to please enter your questions in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll repeat them for our audience, those of you who are not chained to a computer. So with that, perhaps let us begin. I would like to start with Pavlo Smytsynuk. He'll be our first speaker today. Pavlo earned a PhD in theology from Oxford University and then went on to become the director of ecumenical studies at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. He became a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Religion at Princeton University until 2024, before becoming a faculty member at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He's written extensively on religious peace building, political theology, and understandings of a just peace. So I now turn to Pavlo. Please join me in welcoming him. And Pavlo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for the introduction. I'm just coming from an event at George Washington University where I'm visiting fellow on Ukraine. And the question of religion got really a lot of interest. So I will mention three things. First, I would like to speak a little bit about the international advocacy of Ukrainian churches in midst of this war. I will then speak shortly about war and orthodoxy, leaving, of course, more practical issues to Andriy and legal issues to Dmytro, and then about war and secularization. So last week here in the Washington was very intense with the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, a lot of Ukrainian bishops being present, giving lectures, meeting people at the White House, with people in the parliament and other policymakers, lectures and prayers. Shortly earlier, there was a Ukrainian week organized by the Protestants and a lot of events at the International Religious Freedom Summit, where a metropolitan of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Epiphany, was present. So we see that church leaders are very, very engaged in this international advocacy. Sviatoslav Shevchuk has met few months ago Emmanuel Macron, Giorgia Meloni, Chancellor Scholz. Ukrainian Protestants, yes, are believed to have been able to change the heart of the House of Parliament, Johnson, regarding the help to Ukraine. So I think we've seen this earlier, but not on the same scale. I think the scale of Ukrainian religious advocacy has really risen over the past 3 years. And while traditionally in the diaspora, where Ukrainian Greek Catholics and maybe to a certain extent Ukrainian Orthodox who played leading roles, today Protestants are becoming more and more visible. I think at the beginning, in the 90s, beginning of 2000, Protestants were much less interested in politics, but this has started changing with Maidan, and now we see them as incredibly active. Another important point in relation to this international advocacy was a recent meeting between Metropolitan Epiphany and Pope Francis. Yes, the Holy See has previously resisted direct contacts, saying that it doesn't want to interfere with inter-Orthodox affairs. I remember Nadia Kitsenko once claimed, and I agreed with her at the time, that the Vatican will recognize the Orthodox Church of Ukraine only once all Orthodox churches would have done so. But we see that this hasn't been the case. So I think another important point in like international life of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was its membership in the Conference of European Churches, which I think might be an important step to a membership in the World Council of Churches. So I think a lot of progress, which I think wouldn't have been there without this horrible and tragic war. Even the Ukrainian Orthodox Church makes its voice heard internationally, maybe not so much as advocacy of Ukraine, but more of their own rights, and often through people who are not members of the church. We've seen a lot of a couple of pieces by Thomas Bremer, Natalia Vasilevich, but also some very weird advocates like Robert Amsterdam, yes, who was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, who was speaking at the panel at the this international summit for religious freedom, where J.D. Vance was present, not on that panel, but else on some other moments. So we see that this is really very important. My second point has to do with war and the Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodoxy and international Orthodoxy. So the war has led to almost universal condemnation of the Russian Orthodox Church. Paradoxically, those who was more passive on this were the other Orthodox churches, except of Greek-speaking churches and the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Catholics and Protestants were also very much part of this process. Pope has called Kirill an altar boy. Cardinal Koch, responsible for ecumenism, has spoken about the heresy of the Russian Orthodox Church. There were very strong statements from the Council of, from the Conference of European Churches, and so on. Now the question is, did Ukrainian churches manage to capitalize on this? And I think the answer is not really. So to a certain extent, as I mentioned, the meeting of Metropolitan Epiphany with the Pope, the CAC's membership for Orthodox Church of Ukraine. But I think that I would expect something more robust. Of course, it takes time. The intra-Orthodox situation doesn't help. On the contrary, it damages the Orthodox Church of Ukraine's image abroad. It gives Russian Orthodox Church some arguments to criticize Ukraine. So the situation is really hasn't been used in the best way. And the last point that I would like to mention, that there have been no recognition of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine as autocephaly after 2020. So those recognitions by other Orthodox churches that have happened all happened during 2 years after the proclamation of autocephaly. Nothing has happened during the war. Finally, my third point regards war and secularization. Now, the war, as every conflict, is believed to lead to increase in religiosity. I will share just 2 slides to make my point here. How many time do I still have? How much time do I still have, Kathy?
Still 5 minutes, Pavlo, so you're okay.
Wonderful. So 2 slides from the recent Razumko Center statistics. And I'm very sorry to be talking about statistics in presence of sociologists of religion here present among us. But what we can see here is that war has led to an increase in people who declare themselves as believers. Yes, the number went drastically up in 2022. So if in 2021, 67% said to believe, in 2022, 74, so increase by 7%. And if you look at the young people, this increase was even bigger. It was an increase from like a 12% increase between 2021 and 2022. And we can interpret this data as confirming the principle that crisis leads to an increase of religiosity, religious practice, and Maidan also can be seen as an example of this. You see the change from 2013 to 2014. At the same time, we see that that the numbers are returning to the pre-war levels. So we see that now there is a decline in those who say that they are believers. And among young people, this is visible even more. So we see that this change that happened after Maidan and after the start of the full-scale invasion is not permanent. Now, religious leaders often speak of development, yes, by which they mean development of ecclesial structure, which is certainly very important, especially given that they need to remediate to the damages that have been done to religious structures during the Soviet period. While the structures are being taken care of, dioceses, parishes created, etc., there is a tendency to the decline in the number of people who believe. And I think that's a very complex phenomenon. It has been going on in the West and elsewhere. But I think this is a call to religions to see that their current position is not something that will be permanently present in the form in which we observe it. I think the war can work in both ways. On the one hand, yes, it maybe it brings people closer to spirituality or to God. Yes, there is the saying that in the trenches there are no atheists. At the same time, it can question maybe God's wisdom, God's existence. And I wonder to what extent the religious conflicts in Ukraine, the criticism of, I think, often very deserved criticism of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is not also something that in popular perception is spread onto religious institutions as such. So I think there is a sign that a call for the religions and churches in Ukraine to at least have a serious exam of conscience and reflection. And the international diplomacy and development of structures will not per se remediate on that. So there are, I think there is a need to some more in-depth reform from that point of view. So I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pavlo. And that's a good segue to our next speaker, who is Andriy Fert. He's widely viewed as a rising star among young historians of contemporary Ukraine. He's written extensively on church-state relations and on historical memory. He earned a PhD from Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and he currently teaches at the Kyiv School of Economics. He's been involved in multiple research projects, and most recently at ZOIS, the Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin, where he has researched and written on perceptions and self-perceptions of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So please join me in welcoming Andriy Fert.
Good evening. Oh, yes, good afternoon. It's evening in Kyiv. So hello, thanks you for inviting me, and thanks for this nice words that you said. I've realized that this morning that if not for this event, this anniversary actually would have passed by unnoticed by me, because I try to distance myself from the news and, you know, do teaching and research and not thinking about the anniversaries coming up. But yeah, here we are. And I'd like to actually pick up where Pavlo just left off, just a little comment, because it's important to stress at this moment that at this point that there's no solid data that allows us to say that this conflict between different Orthodox churches really promotes the secularization. So it really requires some in-depth studies, which are not being done at the moment. But still, this sentiment is very popular among the priests and parishioners of the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, whom I interviewed for my research. They basically, many of them said practically the same thing, that because of the war and because of this public pressure that their churches faced, many people left the church, and they didn't left for some other church, they simply left. And this creates this, you know, very remorse and very unhappy, gloomy feelings among these people, that they believe that this war and pressure from the society and from the states really pushes people out from the church. But that's only they saying that, and there's no like real studies into this problem to corroborate these claims. But I do know that many people tend to believe that because of this rift between different Orthodox churches, the secularization actually is on the rise. And I do remember, actually, it's funny little trivia for you, but back in the day when I was studying back at school, and we've been studying this Orthodox conflict of the 20th century in school, and the school history textbook at the day when I studied there was like more than 10 years ago. Yeah, so even then, this textbook says practically the same thing about the 1990s, that because of the intra-Orthodox conflicts in Ukraine, the secularization was on the rise. So that's like a very popular argument that resurfaces every once in a while. So, but really some in-depth research are needed to find out if it's really plausible and relevant or not. So as Kathy mentioned it, I have conducted last year a study of the church that is being regarded widely in Ukraine as being a pro-Russia organization, or to some extent linked to Russia or whatever. So the church that's commonly referenced to as Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And I should say that I'm not ecclesiologist and expert in canon law, so I have no idea whether this church still belongs to the Moscow Patriarchate or not. And the funny thing is that during my interviews with priests and parishioners of this church, there were like many opinions about that among them. So they have no like a uniform monolithic opinion about whether they are being part of the Moscow Patriarchate or not. So some people said, obviously we broke all ties with Russia in 2022, but there were others, and many of them, who said, no, we're still part of the Moscow Patriarchate, and we should acknowledge that. So even inside of this church, the opinions, whether they belonged to the Moscow Patriarchate or not, is still very polarizing and divergent. So I have no idea how to comment whether they're still members of the Russian church or not. The thing is that the government, the Ukrainian government, believes that they're still being part of the Russian church, and that is why the government introduces some restrictive legislation, and I think Dmytro will be talking more about that. So I will not be stealing his bread. And I want to mention that obviously also three things that I think are very important that I have the key takeaways from my study of this Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And the first one is this growing rift between the active members of the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate and the outsiders. I mean, outsiders in most general terms of most general way of speaking. So the parish priest, so I studied mostly parish priest and active parishioners, so those people who attend churches on a regular basis and who priest thinks of being as parishioners. So the priest recognizes them as parishioners, so there's no doubts about them, etc. So from the perspective of view of this, like church regulars, from the church regular members and clergy, they live in a time when the outsiders, whoever they are, they try to impose their will, try to impose their vision, what their church should do. For example, to force them to introduce Ukrainian language for the communal prayers. So because, as you probably know, the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate still uses Church Slavonic language for the communal prayers. And there's this broad sentiment in the Ukrainian society because of the specific pronunciation of the Church Slavonic that is in use in this church, that it's been a Russian language, in fact, and that creates lots of tension on the ground. So the people inside of the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate believes that the outsider simply doesn't understand how church works, and yet there to dictate what church should do. For example, change the language from the Russian to Ukrainian, and they are not very happy about that. And moreover, there is this very popular sentiment with which I faced many a time during the interview. It is about that outsiders taking over, seizing our temples, seizing our places of worship illegally, and transfer it to some other Orthodox church, to the church that Pavlo mentioned, this other Orthodox church of Ukraine that is autocephalous. So there's this growing public sentiment among this church regulars of the Moscow Patriarchate, saying that these people are not truly religious, they're not truly church attendants, and then they don't really partake in rituals and prayers in church life, but still they think they can do something about the church, and they took over our religion, the places of religious worship from us, and then these places of worship stands empty because no one wants to attend them. Obviously, to corroborate that sort of claims, the real in-depth research of every case of this sort is, well, of need, and it's impossible to sustain whether this temples that are transferred from one church to another really stands empty as the people claim. It's not true. But the thing is that this sentiment is very popular, that outsiders take over our places of worship and we should do something about it, and there's nothing to be done at the moment. And also, one more thing about this anti-outsider sentiments is that outsiders don't understand the way church works and the way we do here as religious people. For example, there's growing sentiments among the Ukrainian society towards the decolonization, to getting rid of the Russian historical figures and monuments to these historical figures in the public space, translated at some point into this narrative that we should get rid, for example, of veneration of some Russian statesmen and military figures as saints in the churches of the Moscow Patriarchate. And I observed many instances where priests and parishioners of the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate try to reimagine, to reframe the cults, for example, of Prince Alexander Nevsky or Tsar of the last Russian Emperor Nicholas II, whom they still venerate as saints. And in my attempts to understand why they still venerate them and how they try to reimagine these figures of veneration, they basically said to me that the society, these outsiders who are not members of the church and who demands the church to stop venerating them, says that they simply don't understand why church venerates some people, why they choose to canonize the people. So this conflict between insiders and outsiders is very, very, very pronounced and very visible there. It's still present there. And also another thing that it's very pronounced and it's very visible in my research is that the tension between the parish priest and the parishes in general on the one hand, and the bishops who are ruling the church is growing. It's not of critical scale at this moment, but still it is there. And there were many instances where priests and even some parishioners said that they are unhappy with how their bishops act and what they do as church administrators. And particularly, they were not happy how their bishops, some unwitty and not very well thought out statements put their parishes in jeopardy because people, this activists, come to their parishes and says, look what your bishop just said. Look what they just refused to recognize Russia as aggressor, or called the priests and bishops on the Russia-occupied territories as heroes of Ukraine or something like that. So the tension between parishes and bishops who rules the church is growing. And last thing that I wanted to mention here is that I was struck when I was completing my study that actually, despite of the war and despite of this growing public disapproval of the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, nothing really changed in the way this people, this church regulars, explain the world around them and explain the reasons for this public hostility and explain their choices to do it, to practice religion the way they practice religion. So, for example, in the case of refusal to introduce more Ukrainian language in this communal prayer, there was a fantastic study that was conducted, I imagine, in 2019 by my Swedish colleague, Per Arnebodin. And practically all those things that the people from the Moscow Patriarchate said about their refusal to introduce Ukrainian language back in 2019 was the same things they said to me in 2024. So nothing really changes over the time, and that's like really striking, and I don't really understand why it's happening like that. And yes, I'm wrapping up. So the one last thing that I want to mention that it was present like in practically all interviews that I've conducted is that feeling of pessimism that whatever, so that practically everyone said that it doesn't matter whether we change something or not, whether we try to, explain to society that we are not really the Moscow church, we're not spreading like any pro-Russian narratives or whatever. It doesn't matter, the society is not ready to listen to us, so there's no need to try to court the society and convince them we're not bad guys. So because the society is not ready to listen. So thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Andriy. Our final speaker today will be Dmytro Vovk, who is a legal scholar specializing in church-state relations and constitutional law. Dmytro previously taught at Yaroslav Mudry National University in Kharkiv and at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. He's currently a visiting professor of law at Cardozo Law School of Yeshiva University in New York City. He is widely consulted for his views on issues pertaining to freedom of religion, belief, and conscience in Ukraine. He hosts a podcast that enjoys a broad audience called Talk About Law and Religion. So, Dmytro, we turn to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. I'll address the topics through the lens of law and religion, which practically means the combination of two aspects, the religious freedom issues and religion-state relations. And it's obvious that the war, especially the full-scale invasion, has affected both aspects and therefore affected the life of religious communities in a way, the whole Ukrainian society. Obviously, in terms of religious freedom and religion in general, the situation is different on occupied territories and the rest of Ukraine. The occupied territories have remained the place of blatant and constant violations of religious freedom. And while the full-scale invasion has not changed the trajectory of this process, we see persecutions, constant persecutions of religious minorities, priests, leaders, believers, fake trials over priests and believers, detentions, and so on and so forth. That started in Donbass and Crimea in 2014. The invasion actually brought the geographical expansion of the same process on newly occupied territories. I'm thinking, for example, of Melitopol and Zaporizhia, Kherson region, and so on. What the invasion has intensified, though, is the discussion of the role of religion, and first of all, the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in the Russian aggression and possible responsibility in terms of international criminal law. And it's a sort of matter in progress. We see that discussion of the role that the Russian Orthodox Church and Patriarch Kirill personally has played or has been playing in the crime of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanities, especially the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in the deportation and the re-education of Ukrainian children. And it's a separate and difficult issue. It's probably an issue for a separate workshop. The overall feature of these discussions that I see, that I observe, is that religious scholars, political scientists, and religious people are significantly more eager to discuss this topic and to discuss how for example, Kirill or the whole church will be prosecuted. While international criminal law specialists are more pessimistic, especially when it comes to war crimes and crimes against humanity, with again the exception of the deportation issue. Now, coming back to the Ukrainian territories under the government's control, we see two basic issues that are constantly discussed: that the law banning the Russian Orthodox Church and potentially banning the Ukrainian Orthodox Church affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate, and the conscience objection issue, the right of objectors to be exempt during the time of the war. But we also see quite interesting dynamics of religion-state relations determined by the war and especially full-scale invasion. And I want to sort of, present these topics as overlapping. We know that Volodymyr Zelensky came to power with agenda significantly or heavily focused on social and economic issues over cultural and religious identities. The president was very reluctant to speak about religion, to attend any religious fest. He even ignored, basic Christian celebrations and fests. And that approach has been changed significantly since the invasion. The Ukrainian government and President Zelensky personally have become more involved in religion and inter-religious, first of all, inter-Orthodox relations. In December 2022, Zelensky announced what he called as the protection of spiritual independence of Ukraine as a state priority. And this issue has started as a security case of one particular religious community, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but then it has got a broader agenda, still probably security related, but often very indirect. The most discussed issue, the law against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, provides a legal mechanism to ban the church, but also contains two non-USC related or non-security related provisions that religious communities have been lobbying for years or even decades. In particular, the law makes possible for them to obtain state-owned properties and free of charge long-term use. Previously, it was the paid rent only. Also, the law canceled the duty of religious communities to disclose the ultimate owners of their property. Initially implemented as anti-tax dodging business-related measure, it has also affected religious communities by imposing a similar, quite burdensome requirement on them, and the law finally canceled that. Then, in October 2024, while presenting his plan of resilience of Ukraine, Zelensky announced what he called as the shift to a more cooperative model of church-state relations that again has been lobbied by religious actors and their political sponsors and supporters for years. And as the first measure of this cooperation, the government announced that religious organizations would be allowed to get exempt up to 50% of the clergy from the mobilization. And it's a very sensitive, as you probably understand, very sensitive issue for the Ukrainian society. And given that many clerics are exempt for other reasons like health, age, 3 or more children, that practically means that all or almost all clerics, in a very broad meaning of this term, because think about Jehovah's Witnesses, Protestant communities, Muslim communities who are clerics there, so they will be exempt. And the government has already clarified that this exemption will not be applied to non-registered communities and also the communities of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate. And this recently adopted exemptions have resonated with another example of religious exemption that the Ukrainian government has constantly refused to provide, the alternative service for conscientious objectors. And while the Ukrainian constitution guarantees the right to alternative service for those who claim it for religious reasons, under martial law, the government has constantly refused to provide the right to guarantee the right to alternative service, and the Supreme Court of Ukraine several times confirmed there could be no alternative service during the martial law. And as a result, we have about 11 sentences, 11 conscientious objectors sentenced to jail or suspended sentences, and we have about 90 cases that overall 90 cases that are now in the court, and potentially 200 or 300 that will come to the court in the near future. And so it's quite an issue, and there is an interesting opposition between the readiness of the government to exempt priests, but not the government still not ready to exempt objectors from like regular believers, like ordinary believers. And there are two aspects of this problem. First is human rights aspect, and another one is a religious state relations aspect. Yes, why the government is ready to exempt priests but not believers. And from the human rights perspective, this approach makes little sense. First of all, the right to conscientious objection is a very well-established right, while the exemption of priests is more sort of discretion or margin of appreciation of the state and a benefit based on the mere fact of ecclesiastical status, because they do not receive that benefit because of their own status, because their own relation to the war, to weapon, and so on and so forth. They receive it as a part of a corporation, as a part of a religious entity. And the government denies individual claims for alternative service, and still ready to satisfy this collective claim coming from religious communities, including the biggest one, like the Orthodox community and Greek Catholic community. But if you look, so in terms of human rights, it actually doesn't work. We can discuss whether there's an objection in times of the war, but certainly there is no right to be exempt in the capacity of in the ecclesiastical capacity. There is no right of the cleric to be exempt from the mobilization. But if you look at this opposition from the perspective of religion-state relations, this opposition is in a way quite logical. The dynamics of shifting towards a more cooperative model, together with the task to promote spiritual independence announced by the state, actually presupposes, or at least some sort of tolerates, if you want, this opposition. First of all, while objectors are usually from unpopular minority, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, and so on, which some sort of refuse to contribute to public good in times of the war, refuse from the mobilization. Clerics are usually belonged and sponsored by the biggest religious communities. Second, while objectors is a sort of matter of concern for small minority groups, priests are matter of concern from the biggest religious communities that are supposed to be partners of the state in this potentially new cooperative model. And certain within this, the third point is within this approach, it actually makes a lot of sense in that refusal to provide this exemption to not registered communities and the EOC clerics, right? Because non-registered communities, they could not be partners in this protection of spiritual independence. They were small, they're invisible, while the USC is declared to be an enemy of the state and an enemy of this spiritual independence. So we see that some sort of movement to this more cooperative model, and it's still very practical, it's still sort of quid pro quo issues, but we will see how it will develop in future. And just one final point about the USC, I actually do not want to spend a lot of time on that because there are not so many updates. We know that there is a law, and it seems like we are reaching a sort of deadlock, both in political and legal terms, because on the one hand, we have the government that has been preparing to ban the church. There should be no illusions about that. All bylaws that the government needs to do this, they are in progress, and they probably be adopted by the cabinet of ministers in the near future. Second, we see that the position of the leadership of the church, at least the part of the leadership of the church, is again very non-constructive. They're very reluctant to address any sort of government's concerns, and we see this recent, that Pavlo mentioned, this recent interview of Robert Amsterdam to Tucker Carlson, when Amsterdam sort of reiterated this Donald Trump's points about Zelensky as a dictator, USA that created the OCU and all that stuff. And it seems like at least a part of the leadership of the church shared these views, and it actually makes the situation even worse within the Ukrainian society and will not help them on the international level, in my view. So we see that in a way everybody is satisfied. The Ukrainian government, because they have a quite solid ground to ban the church, the part of leadership because they hope that some sort of deal or some sort of negotiations with Russia will preserve their position in the Ukrainian society. Finally, the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian government, because they're very happy because they can really keep claiming about persecutions, about history, about of the church. But obviously, it's a significant and it's a very big problem for communities on the ground, which are blamed, shamed for being part of Putin's church, and so on and so forth. And in terms of any sort of resolution, I think at this point we see no sense of optimism, no reason for optimism. We'll stop there, but we can discuss it more in Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dmytro. So I invite members of our audience to please put questions in the chat. We have several in already, so I'd like to begin with a question for Andriy Fert. If you could please define outsiders more carefully. Do they include occasional defenders? You spoke about the differences between the outsiders and those who actually attend the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. Are they different groups in villages or in cities? And also, do you include those who have left the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate?
Yeah, thank you for the question, dear Frank. I don't see you, but I imagine you're somewhere there. Well, this separation between insiders and outsiders is rather this dichotomy that exists in the narratives of my interviewees, but that it's not my approach to define that. So in these interviews that I have collected, that's this outsiders, they pops up regularly and every time, and that means sometimes different things. Yeah, sometimes speaking about the outsiders, the interviewees, so this members of the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, means the media, means the activists who demands the separation for some clarification of the current status of the church and don't belong to this church, etc. Sometimes it is exactly what you said, what you stated in your question, that there's non-regular attendance. So in a village, for example, there's a group of people who regularly attends the church services and the group of people who, in a way, shows up at the church on Easter or Christmas, donate some money for church restoration things and etc., but don't partake actively in the church regular parish life. So yeah, in that way, in these cases, yes, there's people inside of the church define those people as being outsiders. And also as outsiders, they define these government officials who are not members of the church, but still wants to do something about this church relations with Russia or the church religious practices. So this term outsiders that is used by my interviews is very, very heterogeneous, and it defines a whole bunch of different peoples, and it requires a very careful in each case, it means different set of people. So it's actually, I take it rather as some sort of a defensive concept that the regulars of the church use in order to explain and justify their way of doing what they do. So they employ this concept of outsiders in order to protect their choices and their approach to what they do in their temples and their places of worship.
Just a quick follow-up question to Andriy. Do they define this outsider status in ethnic terms or national terms? Do they claim to be Russians or Ukrainians?
No, nothing like that. But in a way, in some way, in a very remote way, whenever this question of outsiders pops up in the conversation with the regular attendants of the URC, it inevitably brings up another thing, that those people, outsiders, are interested in politics more than they're interested in religion. So they're not truly religious. They're like motivated to talk about the church matters by the nationalism, by Ukrainian nationalism, by these ideas related to the nationalism that there should be an autocephalous church and an independent state, something like that. So it's not about the ethnic terms to define the outsiders, but it in a way can lead us to this, in this direction at least.
Thank you. And now here's a question for any of the panelists. Do we know if Robert Amsterdam, the famous lobbyist, do we know if he is officially or unofficially employed by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate?
That's probably the question, first of all, to myself. I have no idea whether what sort of official relations the church has had with Robert Amsterdam. I assume, I doubt that the church has paid to him. At least I see no sense in that. I think it's one of the sponsors, and there's a sort of common wisdom that it's Vadim Novinsky who is that sponsor paying to Robert Amsterdam. But I do think that at least on the level of representation, he probably has some sort of he has some right to represent the church, and probably he has some documents, the Vironisted, we would say in Ukrainian, to represent the church. But the thing is that strikes me in this situation is that. Somehow we has made the issue of Robert Amsterdam central to this problem. However, if you think about Amsterdam as a lawyer of the church, it seems quite reasonable and logic that the church has a lawyer, and that lawyer is actually a way to bring the church views or church sponsor views or important people within the church views to bring into the actors that might somehow affect the situation and somehow change the situation. And this is something very logical, focusing on the problem of the lawyer, and it actually is in a way unfruitful. It makes personal to me, it makes no sense, because I would be surprised if there was no lawyer of the church. What is, however, interesting, and to what extent that recent interview that Amsterdam did, and was all this, attempts to fit to Trump's terminology against Zelensky, to what extent and it fits that complies with the position of the church and with the leader of the church, because it seems like there are several centers of influence within the church, and it also could be it can tell us something about the relations between those centers of influence.
A follow-up question on exactly that note to Dmytro has to do with exactly those other centers of influence. Whatever happened to those signatories in May 2022 who signed onto an open letter trying to influence the direction of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate? Do you have any insight as to what has become of those priests and their leadership and their efforts to shape the relationship to the Russian Orthodox Church?
Well, I frankly probably not the best specialist in this inter-religious and internal religious issues. What I know that it seems like there is no one sort of policy against those priests, and there is no one policy towards the whole issue within the church. It seems like depending on the situation, depending on the bishop, depending on the region, there could be very different approaches, similarly to the language of the liturgy, similarly to what priests can say to their believers, both publicly and non-publicly, and so on and so forth. As I said, it seems like the church is very reluctant to do anything, right? To be more vocal with respect to this priests involved in collaboration, to be more cooperative with the state. But on the opposite side, it seems like if you would like, to conduct liturgies in Ukrainian, you can do that, and no sanctions will follow. If you would like to to be involved with the support of the army, to provide any sort of activities like that. It's you're very welcome. So it doesn't look like a, very well controlled hierarchy anyway.
Okay, we have first.
May I jump at this point? A little comment regarding this priest who signed these petitions for the church leadership in UOC. Actually, I haven't actually studied this particular group of priests. I deliberately avoided this publicly active priest. But all the same, in my interviews with the other priests who are not publicly active, and with many parishioners, that topic also resurfaced, that they're very critical of this initiative. And the reason why they're very critical is sometimes it struck me at some point that they say that they're not supporting the priests who demand this active separation between the UOC and the Russian Church, because those priests are saying very nasty words about the current leadership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So for people whom I interviewed, it was difficult to bear that those people are so critical and that they attack personality instead of attacking some systematic problems, but they were attacking personality, the personality of bishops, of Metropolitan Onufry, etc. So they were generally approving the idea of separation, more vocal separation between the UOC and the Russian Church. But at the same time, they couldn't bear this criticism of the church leaders that uses so many nasty words that they put it in some interviews.
Wonderful. We have a question now for Pavlo. It has to do with the idea of partnership. It's been mentioned several times, the idea of a new kind of cooperative model. And when the Archbishop Shevchuk of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was in Washington recently, he stressed very much a movement towards forging partnerships with the state as opposed to a state church. Could you share any insight as to what that partnership might look like, what form it might take?
Yes, thank you, Taffy. I don't know. I haven't seen the draft of from what I understood is the law that the all Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations is reflecting about. My understanding is that this organization is preparing a paper that can become a future legislation and which would contain some principles about this partnership of Ukrainian religious organizations and the state. I think that on the one hand, the churches have been somehow frustrated with Ukrainian state, and it's not only Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but also other churches in what regards the question of military draft. Yes, well, Dmytro was talking about this, but it took a lot of time until the solution has been found that clerics will not be obliged to serve in the army. And I think it wasn't a law, it was sort of an act of the cabinet of ministers. I think there was a question about property. So I think this the churches believe that they are doing a lot for the state, that they are contributing a lot both domestically in terms of bringing or mobilizing international charities to come to Ukraine, helping to deal with the refugees, helping to keep this contacts between Ukrainians in Ukraine and Ukrainians that left Ukraine, and certain decisions of Ukrainian government have almost pointed to a creation of a wall between two types of citizens, and the churches are very I think active in creating bridges between Ukrainians in Ukraine and those outside, and they expect a slightly a better working relationship with the government. maybe I'm pushing this too far, but I have a feeling that that the churches believe to be the government prefers to have them as an instrument, rather than a partner. So there is this desire to work out some relationship that would take religious positions more seriously. I don't know, how this can develop, but it might be a good moment right now.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, Pavlo. So we have one quick comment from Oksana Shevel before we go on to more questions. She notes that in terms of Amsterdam, his firm filed a foreign agent disclosure, which is publicly available. And in it, Amsterdam said his client is the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. It pays him a fee. Perhaps the money comes from Novinsky, but on paper, at least, Amsterdam works for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Here is our next question. It has to do with, and anyone is free to answer, it has to do with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and its opening of parishes outside of Ukraine. Would you like to comment on what perhaps are the rights of diaspora Ukrainians at this key moment when so many are outside of Ukraine, and what then could or should be the response of religious communities? And anyone can respond there. Okay, Pavlo?
Yes, I would shortly comment on this. So I think there are two different situations. One is in Central and Western Europe, and another one is in countries where Ukrainian diaspora has much more elaborate structures. So if you look at North America, Ukrainian Orthodox have structures, parishes, and they can cater for Ukrainians more easily. In terms of Central and Western Europe, the situation is slightly more complicated. So traditionally, Ukrainians or many Ukrainians would go to the parishes of Russian Orthodox Church, which sometimes would have a maybe Ukrainian clergyman as a parish priest. Now, starting with Donbass, the war in Donbass, and especially with the full-scale invasion, the situation has changed drastically. You have still places where most Ukrainians would go to the Russian Orthodox Church. Maybe the parish priest was more, neutral or even supportive of Ukraine, but in many cases that wasn't the case. So hence the need for Ukrainian Orthodox have their own parishes. Now, it's from canonical perspective, it's difficult. First of all, Ukrainian Orthodox Church hasn't been developing a structure because it was, or maybe still is, part of the Russian Orthodox Church. So at the end of the day, when the moment they are starting opening their own parishes, it's almost a sign that they are an independent autocephalous church. So I think there is also a positive way to interpret the fact. Because if we say they are not independent, it means that they wouldn't have a canonical right to establish parishes outside Ukraine. And if they establish those parishes, and if the other Orthodox churches, Serbian, Polish, particularly of Constantinople, somehow interact with them, it's sort of a grassroots recognition. Finally, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine also, according to Thomas, shouldn't be opening, its own parishes, and the Ukrainians who belong to this church would go to the parishes of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And although this patriarchate has some Ukrainian clergy, the majority are not Ukrainians. Yes, many of them are Greeks, and it creates all sorts of problems because the parishes are not just, a place for sacraments, but also for community and culture. So I think they are the body that struggles most with opening these parishes. But I think there was a little bit of debate to what extent the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's parishes are sort of, islands of Ruski Mir. And I think we need like Andriy, once he's done with his current research, to go and do some sociology on those parishes. What do what are the homilies there? What language do they preach in? What people think of their mission and identity.
Thank you. Just one point of clarification. Unless Oksana wishes to change what she has written, she writes that according to a this publicly available disclosure form, that Amsterdam claims to be employed by the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. I don't know whether perhaps Oksana mistyped there, but that is what she wrote, and that's why I stated that. We have nonetheless come to the end of our hour. This is an important date where many people have multiple commitments, as they should. I wish to extend a special thank you to each of our very fine panelists, Pavlo Smytsynuk, Andriy Fert, and Dmytro Vovk, to thank them for their, Oksana, she said, okay, Oksana offers that she meant, wait, no, well, now you've crossed things over, Oksana, but I think you mean the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because now you cited something that doesn't exist. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate is the entity that is paying Robert Amsterdam. Okay, that makes sense. Okay. So there we go. It is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate that is identified on a publicly available disclosure form as the entity that is paying Robert Amsterdam, just to be crystal clear on that.
So we get confused with all these abbreviations, because the other day I had this class with my students and I dedicated the whole PowerPoint slide to these different abbreviations that we have to explain what each of them meant and how it come to life at some point in history. So it's like a mess.
It's sort of an alphabet soup. That's true. So we thank all three of you for your expertise that helps us understand all of these abbreviations and so much more, and for especially sharing your thoughts on this particularly difficult day. So thank you to all of our audience and for everyone who's here. And we look forward to seeing you at other Shevchenko Scientific Society events. Good day to everyone.